pretty recently I heard that when the Clinton Foundation were over in Haiti, ostensibly helping Haiti in a way that in retrospect looks pretty clumsy, we're here to help you. Please get your help off of us. And like the money was spent in all sorts of weird, clumsy ways. And even when you see video footage of a sort of a younger, sleeker Hillary Clinton leading George Soros peculiarly through the wreckage of Haiti, even though that's before many of their subsequent disasters, you feel like, what's going on? Why is this guy there? What's happening? So can you explain to us, when these figures that, you know, the defenders of, say there's nothing to worry about when it comes to Bill Gates, he's just a nice dude. Or George Soros, there's no problem there. I mean, I've heard, for example, that George Soros benefits in some way from the conflict between Ukraine and Russia with regard to oil. But I don't understand that. And I wonder if you could help me to understand it, please, Mike.
Let's tie all this together with a comment that I think came from one of the questions on your locals at the start of this, which was, who does the blob work for? You know, I think let's tie all this together with a comment that I think came from one of the questions on your locals at the start of this, which was, who does the blob work for? You know, I think I forget how you teed that up in the beginning, but I almost think of it, you know, like that Austin Powers scene where he goes, who does number 2 work for?
Who does number 2 work for?
That's right, buddy. You show that turd who's boss.
That's a good scene, man. That's one of my favorite scenes. You show that turd who's boss. Right, good. We're on familiar territory. Mike Myers comedy. I feel at home. Yeah, hit me, man.
Right, because that's actually a great way to look at this, because the execution arm of this transatlantic foreign policy blob is the State Department, the CIA, and the DOD, and its swarm army of tens of thousands of paid assets in the media and in the civil society and university realm and things like this. But they are essentially number 2, if you will, working for a class above them who they have a revolving door relationship with, and which is really where people in government make their money and do favors for in order to make their own careers and be able to have their own, you know, put their own kids through private school education and really join an elite class. And that is what I call the corporate and financial donor and drafter class. You might think of it as a co-investor class. And before I delve into this, I'll start with a quick analogy from what I just mentioned with Jared Cohen, who I mentioned, you know, started embedded in essentially CIA hot zones, organizing student groups, and then worked directly at the center of synchronizing CIA and State Department color revolutions on social media, then went directly to Google's essentially CIA branch. But what did Jared Cohen just do a few short years ago? Moved over from Google Jigsaw to the macroeconomic asset management branch of Goldman Sachs. He is now one of the highest ranking officials at Goldman Sachs. Well, what he's essentially doing at Goldman Sachs is he's not a mystic, you know, forecasting what's going to rise and fall in terms of economies or assets to invest in around the world. Because he's got this State Department CIA-backed channel, he allows Goldman Sachs to do what's essentially insider trading at the most macro level. If you know that the military or the State Department or the CIA is going to overthrow a government or privatize an industry, you know, $1 trillion industry in Venezuela or Ukraine that's owned by the state government, but now it's going to be privatized. So if you're an early investor in that, your investment is going to go to the moon. You have this corporate and financial overclass where there's a revolving door. So let's take a step back. What do I mean by donor and drafter class? So let's start with the term drafting. So in a bike race, the ideal strategy is not to be out in front. Even if you're the fastest racer, you don't want to be out in the lead in a bike race because you are bearing the brunt of the full force of the wind, which slows down your traction. You need to exert more work. In corporate terms, that is killing your profits if you're out in front. The ideal strategy in a bike race is to be right behind the person in front so that they do the work cutting the wind and you efficiently, with a very, much less amount of energy, get the same place. And then you overtake that person at the end. And so what corporations do, and by proxy, their financial equity and debt holders do, is they draft behind the blob, the government side of the blob. They draft behind the DOD, the War Department, the Pentagon. So, for example, when the military moves into Ukraine, They draft behind that. When the State Department goes in and threatens sanctions on a country so that it changes its terms of private enterprise or changes its labor laws to make it cheaper they draft behind the State Department. If the CIA is incubating a new emerging leadership class in a country who is going to be favorable to ExxonMobil there, or Walmart there, or an agriculture company there, or a tech company there, they draft behind that. And they also serve as co-investors or donors into those projects, because oftentimes it's not enough just to have U.S. funded allocations to fund a war project or a foreign assistance project. Like, for example, in Ukraine, there's a big issue about how much funding is enough to actually support Ukraine. So part of what the State Department does is they go around to get co-investors in the project in the region so that Microsoft or Google will sort of co-fund it and provide a top up to get the amount of money needed to do this initiative. And actually a great example of this is something like Dia, the Dia app in Ukraine. This is something that I think the Gray Zone, as you mentioned, published a lot about. This is this digital ID system in Ukraine that Zelensky has made essentially mandatory for all Ukrainian people, and it ties their digital identity to their bank account. It's basically the ultimate way to be able to manage a civilization, and it was created by USAID. USAID is the major funding organization that straddles the line between the State Department and the CIA. It essentially serves as an above-board, public-facing State Department agency that funnels the money that is used by the CIA. Essentially, when something gets USAID funding, it becomes an asset for our covert diplomacy. And so USAID funded the creation of this app in a partnership with Google, Visa, and American Express, I believe, were the two transaction companies. So Ukraine doesn't have its own sort of sophisticated IT architecture. The State Department, using its diplomacy arm, has now made mandatory the use of a system that Google profits from because it runs the architecture of Dia, and that Visa and American Express profit from because they process all the commercial transactions of now every citizen in Ukraine. So you now have a locked-in, government-backed cartel over every single person in Ukraine for both, Amex and Google. And so this becomes a very powerful. Now, when you look at who actually sits on the board of these CIA interstitials, so let's take an example. Something called the National Endowment for Democracy is a classic example of this. So in my first salvo here, I talked about how Wisner's Wurlitzer in the era of sort of CIA control over media 1.0 was 1947 to 1975, 1976, which is when the CIA would directly co-opt media organizations. And then this sort of went down in flames when it all came out in public hearings in the Church Committee and Pike Committee hearings in 1975, 1976. President Jimmy Carter, when he won as a Democrat in 1976, promised to put an end to that. He fired 30% of the CIA's operations branch in a single night and basically kneecapped the ability for the CIA to do this work directly. Reagan comes into office in 1980 and wants to revive the sort of full poisonous fang power of the CIA, but doesn't have the bipartisan support to ram this through Congress. And so Reagan's CIA director, Bill Colby, approaches Reagan's attorney general, the head of the Justice Department, and says it was a disaster when media groups around the world were seen as funded by the CIA. What we can do, though, is if we set up a national endowment for democracy promotion and have that be formally firewalled off from the CIA so that it looks like it's just coming from a public endowment. Actually, it's not even public, a private endowment. Then we'll be able to have the same capacities we had from the 1940s to the 1970s, but there won't be CIA fingerprints on it. We'll just intermediate it. We'll just back channel with the heads of the National Endowment for Democracy. And so there was a back and forth between the CIA director, Bill Colby, and the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee at the time, where they came up with the structure that there would be a formal firewall. The National Endowment for Democracy would be a private, non-governmental organization, but that as long as there was Senate Intelligence Committee consent to it, the CIA would effectively direct their operations. And by the way, they're a private, non-governmental organization, but they're under the direct oversight of the House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations Committees. They're a CIA cutout managed by the State Department. Now, the NED, if you look at who's on its board, it's the directors of all these companies. Their board of directors for the National Endowment for Democracy has members of the officers and directors of Google, officers and directors of Amex and Visa, officers and directors of Exxon and Chevron. A great example of this, actually, is in the run-up to the 2014 Maidan coup, the CIA State Department-sponsored overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine. Whether you agree with that or not, them's just the facts. Victoria Nuland actually gave that speech about how they successfully orchestrated this using $5 billion, $5 billion with a B, in State Department and USAID subsidies to the right-wing, right sector groups in Ukraine who did this. She gave that speech bragging about that $5 million in U.S. financial sponsorship of the coup right at a conference that was right in front of, sponsored by Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell. And by the way, those were the exact companies who had invested in the oil and gas space in Ukraine. Chevron had signed in 2013 a $10 billion, again with a B, $10 billion partnership with Naftogaz, the Ukrainian state gas giant, which accounts for an overwhelming majority of Ukraine's national economic sector. Shell had signed a $10 billion, again, a matching $10 billion partnership with Naftogaz in Ukraine, again, with a B. So Halliburton had signed a deal with the Ukrainian government's Naftogaz in order to do all the oil and gas refining of the oil and gas space there. You know who held the rights to the Black Sea shale resources that were destroyed when Russia annexed Crimea? All the shale rights in the Black Sea basin there? It was Burisma. Burisma, not only was Hunter Biden on the board of Burisma, but Hunter Biden himself was on the chairman's advisory board of the NDI, the National Democratic Institute. You know what the NDI is? That's the DNC branch of the NED, which is the CIA cutout created so that the CIA could run money without it having the formal fingerprints of the CIA during the CIA 2.0 restructuring. So Hunter Biden on the board of the CIA cutout, that CIA cutout having on its board all of the oil and gas co-investors, were then marshaling the CIA and the DOD, i.e. U.S. taxpayer funding, in order to prop up their investments in the region. And this same blueprint is replicated everywhere. And virtually every multinational corporation on earth is playing this game and has to play this game to compete with others who are playing it.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.